Welcome to Free Will, Science, and Religion. I'm Mitch J, and I'm with Chandler Clubs and George Ortega. Today we're going to talk about morality and free will.
All right, guys, I think first let's define what we mean by morality, because I think it's a word that has different meanings to different people.
It sure does. Because depending on what your standard of morality is, morality has a different meaning, as does the words moral or immoral. So should we go through some of the common things people mean by morality?
Well, okay, we can start somewhere. Why not?
Yeah.
Let's start there.
Yeah. Like, for example, some people who are religious, they go by divine command theory. That something's moral if God commands it. No matter what it is, because God said it, that's the right thing. But then other people want to go by, they have some philosophical system for what's moral or immoral based on pleasure and pain, or some other principle like virtue ethics, like that honesty is the best policy and it's good to be honest, and so it's an absolute thing that it's good to be kind, good to be honest, that kind of stuff. So I think everyone falls generally under these ideas, and of course the most popular is basically consequentialism, like that the consequences of an action tends to determine how we see it as moral or immoral.
Agreed. So, Nietzsche, or as people like to say in the West, Nietzsche, I don't know, but anyway, well, just want to have a respectful pronunciation. The great, German philosopher. So he understood that free will was bogus, and he talked a lot about this. So he saw morality as a dogma, just like religion, for the points, for some of the points that you just mentioned. So you're right, because it's really when you acknowledge the reality of determinism and you don't misconstrue cause and effect, then you have to come to that logical conclusion, whether you like it or not, that morality isn't what we pretend it is. However, the argument that I would make, and I assume you guys are going to make in a few moments as well, or throughout the podcast, is that morality is a good thing. And it's not a false thing. It's not something that we have created um, in order to control people or for wishful thinking. A lot of people have argued for practical reasons why we should be moral. So this idea of um, trying to improve human well-being or lessen pain and suffering, things like that, you can make this argument that it allows the species to propagate. And we also have this understanding of pain. And pain is really, really, really hard to explain. But we all know pain is bad. Pain is the worst thing there is.
Yeah, I don't think anyone will disagree with that, Mitch.
Right. So we need a moral system. If we, well, some people would disagree, but there's there's some characters out there.
Right.
And so morality comes from empathy. That's where it comes from. So you reject solipsism, reject this idea that you are the only person. You verify your own existence. Therefore, we can only assume only we exist. So you reject that idea axiomatically. Say, okay, I exist, other people exist. We can also verify that pain and suffering are just horrible. It's the worst thing that any living thing with a nervous system can experience. So we don't want it, and we don't want others to have it either.
Right. I mean, I feel like that's a pretty accurate explanation for how I would describe it, that it comes from empathy. And in a certain sense, it's an application of the golden rule, that you don't want to inflict suffering on others just as you would not inflict it on yourself or want others to do it to you. So what I like is that we can take that concept of empathy and viewing others as equal with the general principle that pain is bad, and I feel like that gives us a consistent system that is not subject to, it's not an opinion, it's not one person's idea, it's just something of a shared experience that we can all relate to, and therefore we can all work under that.
All right, so like one other kind of definition that relates to the consequentialist position is, it's also very related to what Mitch you were talking about like, we all agreeing that pain is bad. So like we're hardwired as human beings. This isn't philosophical. This is like biological, to seek pleasure and avoid pain. So John Locke, a British philosopher, he defined goodness as that which creates happiness. So obviously, like evil or badness, which would create unhappiness, and I would say goodness creates pleasure and happiness, and evil, displeasure and unhappiness. So here's the thing. So like, all right, we have, and there's a somewhat of a complication in terms of intent. Like for example, like the consequence definition isn't complete. For let's say a person has two buttons, and one button can make the world a bliss. The other button destroys it and just makes a lot of havoc. So he presses the havoc button, thinking he's doing a bad thing, but actually the buttons are reversed, and he ends up making it. So in other words, do we define his act as a good act because it resulted in a blissful world, or do we define it as an evil act because he intended to wreak havoc on the
Yeah,
world?
so I am not a consequentialist at all. I am a staunch deontologist, I guess is the right word. In other
Oh,
words,
that's a new word. I don't
I,
know
I
that word.
I don't want to get too academic. The point I'm trying to make is that for me, morality is about the actions themselves as opposed to the consequences. So
The intent.
uh, yeah. So the action you're doing itself, we can judge whether or not that action is a moral or immoral action, as opposed to. So some people say, okay, if you kill a bunch of people, but it leads to some really, 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 really good thing, that was moral. That's okay. No, it's not. Life isn't. So life isn't that simple. I'm a big advocate for this idea of moral dilemmas. Some people think of morality as hello.
Hey, it looks like Will just joined us in the middle of a
Oh,
podcast.
How you doing,
all right.
Will?
Hello.
Oh, I'm doing fine. So I was trying to be quiet, but my cousin actually said something. That's why I quickly put the thing on mute. I said, "Oh, yeah."
Excellent.
I
That's,
I didn't realize the thing wasn't muted.
Right.
that's right.
Well, we're
Will,
glad to have you, Will.
yeah,
Yeah.
we're basically
Welcome.
we're exploring morality relative to free will, and so like Mitch was, we're basically exploring whether it's the action that we deem right or wrong, or it's the intent, or it's the consequence. So Mitch, continue with what you were
Yeah.
saying.
So I was saying, deontology is what opposes consequentialism. Okay. We don't need to get all academic. The point is, consequentialism is what you're doing is good. You can do something that some might say is bad as long as it leads to a really good outcome. So if you kill a whole bunch of people, but that leads to some amazing thing, like you can establish a utopian society for 500 years at the sake of doing some horrible thing in the short term, then that was actually a moral act. But I think most people, the majority of people, would say that's bogus. What we really want to evaluate is
Maybe
actions
one
themselves.
maybe one person, like if it was like Adolf Hitler or
Well, even if we killed a really really bad person, I don't think anyone would say that it was good. In other words, so I was talking before you came in. I was approaching this idea of moral dilemmas. So we've all heard about these really famous scenarios, such as, okay, there's a train that's going to kill a bunch of people. It's heading in one direction. If you pull a lever, instead of killing 10 people, you kill 2 people. And as human beings, we don't want to be guilty. We want to live guilt free. We don't want to feel guilty. So we
exactly.
so we like to say things like, well, if we take a particular option, we have done the correct thing. We have done the moral thing. I would argue that sometimes there is no right answer. Sometimes either route is immoral. There's no way to escape the fact that we're doing something wrong.
The lesser of two evils.
Yes,
Yes.
but evil nonetheless.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah, well, you
For
know,
example,
I agree with that, guys, because basically you talked about the lesser of two evils, admitting that something is still not the right thing, it's still not a good thing. We just do it because it seems preferable to be less painful, less bad than the alternatives that we have access to.
Indeed.
All right, so let me propose something. So like we may have different kinds of like definitions of morality, but I think we can like agree that even though as human beings we can't absolutely with certainty know that a lot of our actions are good or bad or whatever, that there is an objective morality. That even though again it's like there are objective facts of the universe, even though we human beings can't know them all. So then the question becomes like, so we do an act and we kind of like define it as either moral or immoral, but then we have to acknowledge we don't have a free will. In other words, we are compelled, completely without any, choice in the matter to do either good or evil. So if it's not our good and evil, how do we describe, to whom do we attribute it, or to what?
Well, that once again we stuck with that problem of the infinite regress, because if you try to attribute it to something or somebody, then it's, well, what compelled them to start this, you know? You
Yeah,
know?
morality is a difficult problem and no one has the answer. So religious people who make that argument from authority, what's right is right because God says it's right. Obviously, that does not really encapture what we mean when we talk about moral actions. If morality is just following laws from a higher authority, that's wrong. That's not what we mean by morality. We're talking about some sort of idealistic attempt to differentiate between right actions and wrong actions. So a religious person doesn't have the answer, a secular person doesn't have the answer, a free will believer doesn't have the answer, a hard determinist doesn't have the answer. Again, you can make an argument for a utilitarian argument for morality. You can make all kinds of arguments, but the truth is there might not be an answer to this one.
Okay,
Right.
but here's something. So let's for the sake of the discussion assume that there is, or propose that there is, regardless of whether we can get it right or understand it as human beings. Okay, but like again, what Chandler, what you said is very it's very on target. In other words, like a lot of people need to believe in free will, because if they consider that we humans don't have a free will, they're left. Remember, 80-90% of people here in the United States either believe in God or a higher power. If we have a free will and if we don't have a free will, then they have to attribute the evil that we human beings do or that we think we do to God. And so Chandler, what you're saying, in other words, like with the infinite regress, if
exactly.
Yeah.
if we make a decision that's evil and there's an infinite regress, we can't even attribute that immorality to God, because we never reach a point in time in the far back time where the decision was made, where the causal chain begins.
Yeah, and you know, that's what's interesting, is because there's going to be a lot of people that's going to be a relief to them, because they don't want to have to blame God as being the fundamental cause of all the evil. So the fact that, even though I don't believe in God, the very fact that we can't blame God either, because the infinite regress that would have been prior cause to lead God to do something, I think that's a good way of explaining it to some of these people.
Okay. W WSD time. So what do you think we can like tell free will believers to help them kind of like feel more comfortable with this idea that we don't have a free will? Like that like so they don't have to blame God. That like, what do you think would resonate well with them?
Well, then again, like I said, if it was a God, yeah, he would be completely at fault. I am not in disagreement that well at all. And secondly, it just like I said, man, the reason why I say with the free will is because you talk to me about it. I ain't know anything about it. I just went along with life and just figured,
Well, yeah, WSD time. I'm basically most people in the world. When we ask them like, do they have a free will or not? A lot of people confuse it. A lot of people think, well, we're talking about political freedom, freedom of speech, religious freedom, and all. So basically, yeah, what this is about is like whether what we do, what anything of what we do is up to us. So that's the thing. So like, if nothing is up to us, if we don't have a free will, then all of a sudden we're left with the question, well, who do we attribute the good that we do to? What do we attribute it to? It's a dilemma.
yeah.
Yeah.
But why is that? I
See,
don't.
that's what makes it. That's what makes it a hard question to answer.
But why is it a dilemma? Why do we have to attribute it to anyone? Like, so I mean, we've said in the past, for example, on a previous podcast, and in our conversations uh,
Want some?
outside of this format, that even when we recognize the reality of determinism and we reject the notion of free will, we still have ample reasons for why we need to solve problems. So if there's a murderer on the street, whether or not free will exists, we have to do something about it. So perhaps we can view morality in that same way. Morality is a problem. We have problems. Immoral behavior, I should say more correctly. Immoral behavior is a problem.
Yeah.
So I don't think we're really in a dilemma. I don't think we have to. I'm not going to say it's a waste of time trying to think about morality. I'm just saying morality is an important issue. But ascribing responsibility or the source of morality, trying to figure that out, is perhaps not as important.
Mitch, I agree with you completely. In other words, like the pragmatic need to
Yes.
identify us or other people who do certain acts that may need to be remedied or corrected or changed and all, absolutely. And that can be done, like, for example, within the mental health system, psychiatry and all, they don't identify as right and wrong. Like people have certain kinds of like symptoms, illnesses. The medical establishment doesn't ascribe evil or goodness to them. They're just basically like we're biological beings. But the dilemma that I'm referring to is not a dilemma in objective truth. It's a dilemma in, like, for example, like relative to the 80-90% of people that believe in God. In other words, like a certain kind of logic would say, well, if we're not, if we don't have a free will and we're not in control of what we do, then God, who supposedly made us and all, who basically, or the laws of nature, whatever, if you want to like be naturalistic, then like nature or God is being moral and immoral. But then Chandler, introduced an even a more complicated component that you can't even like ascribe morality to God or nature because of this infinite regress. So that's the dilemma that I'm referring to. That, like, we want to kind of like have this construct of morality, and certainly we don't need it, Mitch, as you were just saying before, and like to be able to like to kind of like mold ourselves or to react to what we do. But in terms of like a fundamental responsibility, maybe it's a blessing. Maybe the world would be much better off without this concept of morality.
Yeah, maybe so. And I think what George was getting at is that, this is a dilemma for the people who are looking for something or some person to attribute the evil or the good in the world to. And I agree with Mitch that we don't necessarily need to find some ultimate source to attribute things to. And I don't think it works because of the infinite regress. But I think Mitch's point was valid that we can be practical about solving problems in the here and now, regardless of whether we have the knowledge of how those problems began.
Yeah, I like uh, as we said earlier in the conversation, Nietzsche, he addressed these ideas. He talked about morality being a dogma, just like everyone. No, I mean, well, not everyone, but some people may be familiar with his criticism of religion, but he criticized, morality just
Oh,
as
no, that's me.
vociferously. Hello, is everything
No,
okay?
sorry, Mitchell.
Yeah. So you're right. We call certain things bad
Hmm.
and certain things good, and it doesn't really make any sense for all the reasons that you guys have just elaborated on. But
Yeah,
despite that, the truest the truest part of reality is probably pain and suffering. We know, we can feel, we have evidence to support this notion that pain and suffering are horrible, and we need to reduce pain and suffering because it's the most horrible, inescapable thing there is. So
yes.
that is just a problem, in my opinion, that needs to be solved. And anyone who
I
disagrees
agree.
is just not a rational, reasonable person.
Yeah, one question I have, guys, is do you suppose that when we use the words good or bad or moral and immoral, do you suppose those words perhaps give the wrong message and that we should abandon those terms, or do you think they're still useful?
Well, Chandler, I think they're useful just as kind of like labels for behaviors that either create pain or lead to pleasure. But I think what we have to abandon is this concept of fundamental moral attributability. In other words, like we human beings are not responsible for what we do. We're not credit worthy for the good we do. We're not responsible for the evil we do. But apparently, neither is the universe, neither is God or the universe, because of this infinite regress. So fine, we label acts as either good or bad or whatever, and then regulate ourselves and others accordingly to create maximize pleasure and minimize pain, but without the attribution of fundamental responsibility either to us or to God or the universe.
Right. So basically it's recognizing that certain actions are good or bad and they cause pleasure or pain, but we're not saying that people are fundamentally responsible for those acts because we know it wasn't really up to them.
Exactly. And again, we can absolve God and the universe for the same reason we absolve human beings. This causal regress, pain
Yeah.
that regresses back in eternally. It never stops. So like that it transcends logic actually, because how could something like go back eternally? I mean, I don't know. It's beyond our ability to reason. But that absolves even the laws of nature and God.
I,
The thing
I,
is,
I don't blame anyone for anything, and I certainly don't blame inanimate objects for anything.
Yeah, you
So
know what, Mitch?
Yeah,
I used to do that when I was a kid. If I tripped over a chair, I'd throw the chair across the room and blame it.
exactly.
Yeah, I've learned not to.
Same here.
Yeah, so then you see, first I got to where I stopped blaming inanimate objects, and now I don't blame people either.
Right, exactly.
and actually, so in terms of why are we doing these podcasts, these shows, all this is this blame causes so much suffering, so much conflict. It just confuses things. It's irrational and it's unproductive.
Yeah. Um, Will, I know you joined us kind of in the middle of the podcast, but what do you think of this talk we're having?
Oh yeah, I keep forgetting. I keep forgetting my mic is muted at times, so sometimes y'all hear me talk. So, but anyway, yeah, I agree with everything y'all said. I mean,
So,
there's especially with the term religion, that it causes more problems than it solves. A lot more problems than it solves.
Right, and the reason it causes problems again because like religion seems to believe firstly that they have the answer to what's right and wrong, that what a certain book says is right and all, and secondly, the problem religions cause has to do with this topic of free will, with this belief in free will. Because religions promote free will more than any other institution in the world. And so they're
Actually, it
actually
goes against it because
Yeah.
Remember that part where it says "obey me or go to hell"?
Absolutely, it's
Yeah.
self-contradictory. If God is omnipotent, there's absolutely no way we can have a free will. But religions apparently they don't recognize that. They don't accept that contradiction. So yeah, they're probably responsible for so much conflict and animosity and between people that is not just irrational, but it's just so counterproductive to what religion's main goals are.
And how
And
is it moral to give someone free will? To give someone the possibility of going to hell when you
Mitch,
could have just not done that in the first place?
Mitch, excellent. We got to
Uh-huh.
extend that. We've got about 5 more minutes. Yeah, that's an excellent question.
yeah, and you know what's interesting, guys, and one of my biggest problems with religion is that it doesn't have a satisfactory system of morality because there's no system. It's just whatever the big boss says. And so it has no relation to whether those acts cause pleasure or pain. That's completely irrelevant in divine command theory.
Right, but I
So,
want to get yeah,
yeah.
Mitch, Chandler, I want to get back to what Mitch said. In other words, like a lot of people, Christians, Jews, and all say free will is such a wonderful gift. It's the greatest gift that God has given human beings, and that's the most
But the
absurd
same.
statement. It's the most absurd statement I've ever had because it's the free will belief that justifies God's, condemning, evil people to eternal suffering. What I mean, it's if anything, it's the most the most, it's the biggest curse that I can think of.
Yeah,
Reach
Yeah,
on,
it
brother.
said, yeah, well, yeah, it gave the title of Benevolent or Loving.
yeah, I mean, if you try to think of some
Just,
like,
and he said, submit.
why would you? I mean, even if you believe in free will, why would you give somebody the choice to do something that you know is bad for them? And even more importantly, if you give them a choice to do whatever and then punish them for exercising their choice, then it's like you're a hypocrite. It's like you want them to do something so that you can punish them. It makes no sense.
Yeah, I mean, we could just do this all day.
Hmm.
So maybe we should,
Yeah,
Yeah, it's going to be a constant loop,
yeah.
basically.
And so we can apply this, like we can ask people, well, let's say like you as a parent have infinite power over your child. Right now, would you give your child free will, that like with this free will the child can like do wrong things, do mistaken things, do kind of like things that aren't in the child's interest? Or if you were an omnipotent parent, would you prefer, do you think it'd be the more moral thing to do to just like have the child, not have a choice but to do what's right
You
and what's
know,
pleasant?
somebody, I watched this one YouTuber, and somebody, he actually said this. He said if I had the power to give my daughter anything, she would never experience any sort of suffering whatsoever.
Exactly.
Exactly. And who among us wouldn't do that? Absolutely.
that's what I would do. If I could say program a child so that they would always do the right thing that was option A, which is best for them and everyone around them. That's how I would do it.
Or just not create hell in the first place. That's
Very
another.
good.
Yeah, yeah,
But
definitely
that's a
don't want to be.
little.
Yeah, don't want to throw people into a
Exactly.
fireplace.
Yep. And Mitch, so like, yeah, so basically this concept of hell, it actually is like, without the free will belief, the whole, notion of hell would just go out the window because it'd be completely immoral. Okay, we've got about 40 seconds left. Mitch, you want to like wrap things up for us?
Do it
Yeah.
quick, 40 seconds.
So it's okay.
30 seconds.
You can't accept the reality of determinism and still be a moral person. There are practical, utilitarian reasons for morality. I think. Anyone else have any last words?
Want me to count down?
No, that's perfect. We do not need free will for morality. That encapsulates everything. Absolutely.
All right, I guess that's a good place to